Good. Um, how do you how did you develop as a writer to be in Forbes and New York Post and even to a point to the Tonight Show with Jay Leno? How do you get those sorts of gigs where you're producing jokes for newspapers or TV shows?
Well, the writing for Jay Leno actually was the first thing. So
Okay.
as a kid, if I thought of something funny, I wrote it down, and then I just had a box full of random pieces of paper that I never did anything with. But when Jay Leno got the Tonight Show, I would be, on the train in the morning going to my work in the bank, and I'd be reading a newspaper, and I'd see a headline or read a story and think of something funny. And, that would be as far as it got, or maybe I'd tell coworkers what I thought of that morning. And then that night, I would watch the Tonight Show, Jay Leno's opening monologue, and he might be telling the same joke. I'd be like, oh, I should write for him. So I called and I said, I'm a writer in New York, which is technically true at the time. I said, I'm a writer in New York, and I think of some things that are the same style of humor and sometimes the same jokes that he's telling on the show. And I spoke to somebody for a while, and I sent them some information, and they gave me, and this is how long ago it was, they gave me their fax number. Right. And so I'd be reading the newspaper. I was the guy in the train. People thought it was weird because I'd be reading the newspaper and frantically scribbling notes on the newspaper. And then when I got into work, I would type it out, and I'd have a time advantage because New York's 3 hours ahead of LA. So by like 10 o'clock in the morning, I would have, sometimes one joke, sometimes 2 pages of jokes, and I'd fax it in. And if they liked it, they would use it and they'd pay me. If they didn't like it, then they didn't pay me.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So it was on not a commission base, but it was like if it was used, then you'd get paid. If you didn't,
right.
And so that was still while you were working.
While I was a banker, yeah. Luckily, nobody, called me out on it.
What do you find more rewarding? A good stand-up gig or a joke being used on TV?
Well, I'm not writing for TV anymore, but I would say a good stand-up gig, because that's all about me. Because if Jay Leno or one of the other late night talk show hosts tells my joke, it's my joke, but it's their platform. It's their show, and I would get paid, but I would get no credit for it. So absolutely, my favorite thing in stand-up comedy is thinking of a joke right on the way to a gig, and then trying it out when I hit the stage, when the joke is fresh in my mind and I have a lot of energy. That's my favorite thing to happen. It doesn't happen that often.
And you've headlined in 5 different continents.
Yes.
Wow. So this is
not Antarctica, and that's really hard. I've tried. I really tried to find a way to get there to perform. And everybody is like, we're not going to fly. The scarcest resource they have at the science, it's only scientists in Antarctica. The scarcest resource they have are the planes coming over. And they're not going to stick 180 pounds of person in that plane just to go over and make people laugh and fly home again.
Right. Well, you never know. Things get cheaper. They might fly you over.
Maybe I could fly it. Maybe I could pay for
it. What is the Ivy League of comedy?
Okay, so when I started in comedy, I was working in banking, and I would perform in new talent shows at comedy clubs, amateur shows. And my coworkers and friends and some clients would come to the show, and they would say, you were funny and you were clean. The rest of the comedians, a lot of them were filthy. And we don't mind that, but we'd like to take clients to a show because it's a lot of fun, but we can't, because we can't take a client to a filthy show because somebody would, I might get in trouble. Where are the clean shows? And there weren't any. Okay. At least not, there's clean shows in like houses of worship and for charity events, but there were no clean comedy shows at comedy clubs in New York. And I said, there's a demand for this product. I can create a supply. So let me put together a bunch of comedians and I'll borrow the club for a night every once in a while and put on shows. And I needed a name for the group. And at the time, I think there were 4 or 5 comedians that went to Ivy League schools. And I thought if I called it Ivy League comedy, that would sort of sound corporate and fancy. And so that's what I called it for a couple of years. And then I was doing a show at a theater in Washington, D.C., And when we got there, the sign on the marquee said they got it wrong. Instead of saying Ivy League Comedy, it said the Ivy League of Comedy. And I saw that and said, that's a much better name. So I changed it.
Fantastic. And is that still, do you still do that now?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Excellent. And is it the
Not so,
same
not so,
comedian?
it's not this. Well, there were like 5 of us or 6 of us who went to Ivy League schools, and I realized I can't just keep using the same comedians over and over again. So now it's not just the 5 or 6 comedians. There's about 35 of us that I work with pretty regularly, and we do shows not so much at comedy clubs, more at theaters now.
Okay. And what is the role of corporate gigs? And so for example, when I was at university, which is like 20 years ago, we had an evening at the university, and they had an up and coming comedian, UK comedian. I can't remember his name, unfortunately, and he ended up.
You know what? That goes to show that most comedians are not good marketers, because I mention my name several times every time I'm on stage, just so people hear it over and over again.
And then this guy ended up being quite mainstream in sort of like the early noughties when I was at university. But what is the role of sort of students or corporate gigs and things like that? How important is that for you as an entrepreneur?
Well, for a lot of comics, university gigs are great because they pay pretty well, but I'm a little too old for that. Comedians do not, I mean, college students do not want to hear, unless it's somebody famous, they do not want to hear a comedian who's at least as old as their parents. They want somebody much younger. And I didn't start till I was 40. So it's unlikely that I would get a college gig. So I haven't really chased after them. I've done a couple, but for some comedians, it's great. Corporates are good and bad. They're good in that they pay well. They're bad in that sometimes the people don't want to be there, because if you've been at a corporate event, you know, an offsite since 8 o'clock in the morning, and then you worked all day, you listen to people drone on, and then you had a dinner and you're sitting with people that you're sick of. And then after dinner, instead of letting you go home, now you got to listen to this guy talk for a half hour. For some people, they'd be like, I'd rather go home and watch TV or go to sleep. So they're not always the best audiences, but sometimes they are. Sometimes they're a lot of fun.